The biting winter wind howled through the streets of New York City, cutting through the layers of anyone brave enough to face it. Snowflakes danced erratically, carried by unpredictable gusts, and blanketed the city in white. Amid the frozen chaos, Marcus pulled his tattered jacket tighter around him. Its fabric was thin and worn, offering little protection from the elements. He shuffled along the icy sidewalk, his breath fogging in the frigid air, searching for a place to rest. Near a bustling intersection, cars moved sluggishly, their tires crunching against the icy road. Marcus spotted a black luxury sedan pulled over onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in rhythmic desperation. He hesitated for a moment, then made his way toward the vehicle. As he approached, he could see a man in a tailored coat standing by the rear tire, his face twisted with frustration. The man was on his phone, gesturing futilely at the flat tire, but no one seemed to be coming to his aid. "Need a hand?" Marcus asked, his voice raspy from the cold. The man turned, his sharp blue eyes scanning Marcus with suspicion. "I'm fine. Roadside assistance is on the way," he said curtly, though his tone lacked conviction. Marcus glanced at the tire. "In this weather? Could take hours. I can fix that for you. Got a spare in the trunk?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Marcus and the flat tire. It was clear he wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, especially ones with weathered faces and threadbare clothes. But the desperation in his situation seemed to outweigh his initial wariness. "Yeah," he said reluctantly. "It's in the trunk." Marcus nodded and knelt beside the car, examining the situation. The icy ground bit into his knees, but he didn't flinch. "Pop the trunk for me," he instructed. The man complied, watching with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity as Marcus worked. Despite the cold, Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, loosening the lug nuts with the wrench provided and swapping out the tire. His fingers, numb from the icy air, fumbled occasionally, but he persevered. As he worked, the man spoke. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he replied simply. "I'm Brian," the man said. "Brian Thompson." Marcus offered a brief smile, but remained focused on the task at hand. Minutes later, he finished tightening the lug nuts and stood, brushing snow from his knees. "There you go. Should hold until you can get it properly fixed." Brian reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, for your trouble." Marcus shook his head, stepping back. "I didn't do it for money," he said, his voice steady. "I help because it's the right thing to do." Brian frowned, clearly unused to such a response. "At least let me give you a ride somewhere. It's freezing out here." Marcus hesitated but shook his head again. "Thanks, but I'm good. You take care now." Without another word, Marcus turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the swirling snow. Brian watched him go, a strange sense of unease settling over him. As Brian climbed back into his car and drove off, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus, his kindness, his refusal of help, despite clearly needing it. It was a stark contrast to the cutthroat world Brian was used to, where every interaction was transactional. By the time he reached home, the encounter lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. Brian Thompson was not a man easily rattled. As the CEO of UnitedHealth Group, he was accustomed to making decisions that impacted millions, navigating high-stakes meetings, and facing relentless scrutiny. But as he sat in his sleek, glass-walled office the next morning, his thoughts kept drifting to Marcus. Brian tapped his pen against his desk, the rhythmic clicking a rare sign of his distraction. Finally, he buzzed his assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire. "Find someone for me," he said as she entered his office. "A man named Marcus. I don't know his last name, but he helped me last night near Lyndale Avenue. Homeless, I think." Claire raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll see what I can do." Hours later, Claire returned, a file in hand. "I found him," she announced. "He's staying at a shelter downtown." Brian looked up, surprised at her efficiency. "That was fast." "I'm good at my job," Claire replied with a small smirk. "But I should warn you, his story isn't a happy one." Brian opened the file, his expression hardening as he skimmed its contents. Marcus had once been a health insurance specialist with a promising career, But a series of personal tragedies, his wife's battle with cancer, her eventual death, and the medical bills that followed, had left him bankrupt and homeless. Closing the file, Brian leaned back in his chair, a deep frown creasing his brow. He couldn't shake the irony that a man who had once worked in his industry had been crushed by the very system he now led. Later that evening, Brian arrived at the shelter. The air inside was warm, but carried a faint, musty smell, a stark contrast to the polished environments he usually inhabited. He found Marcus sitting at a corner table, hunched over a steaming cup of soup. "Marcus," Brian said, approaching cautiously. Marcus looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Brian, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to thank you properly for last night," Brian said, pulling up a chair, "and to learn more about you." Marcus's posture stiffened slightly. "There's not much to tell," he said, his tone wary. Brian didn't push, instead steering the conversation gently. As they talked, Marcus's guarded demeanor began to soften. He shared bits and pieces of his story, his career, his wife, the downward spiral that had left him on the streets. "I don't blame anyone," Marcus said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Life happens. You just deal with it." Brian leaned forward, his expression earnest. "What if I told you I could help? Get you back on your feet?" Marcus chuckled bitterly. "I've heard that before. People mean well, but it never goes anywhere." "This is different," Brian insisted. "I have the resources to make it happen. All I need is your trust." Marcus studied him for a long moment, skepticism etched into his features. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll give you a chance, but I've learned not to expect much." Brian smiled, sensing a breakthrough. "You won't regret this, Marcus. I promise." As they parted ways, Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just making a business decision. He was making a difference. Little did he know, this decision would change not only Marcus's life, but also his own. The following morning, Marcus stood in front of the mirror of his temporary apartment, staring at his reflection. The man who looked back at him was barely recognizable. Gone were the tattered jacket and threadbare pants. In their place was a crisp white shirt and tailored slacks, courtesy of Brian. He ran his fingers over the smooth fabric, feeling both gratitude and unease. It had been years since Marcus had worn clothes like these, years since he had been anything other than invisible. The weight of the moment pressed on him as he straightened his collar. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Brian, dressed impeccably as always, his demeanor warm but professional. "Ready?" Brian asked, his tone encouraging. "As I'll ever be," Marcus replied. Brian had arranged for Marcus to meet with his leadership team at UnitedHealth Group. The idea of stepping into a corporate office again felt surreal, almost impossible. Marcus tried to push down the anxiety rising in his chest as he followed Brian out to the sleek black car waiting below. The drive was quiet, the city's hum muted by the thick windows of the vehicle. Marcus glanced at Brian, who sat typing furiously on his phone. "Why are you doing this for me?" Marcus asked finally. Brian looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Because I believe in second chances, and because you deserve it." When they arrived at the towering UnitedHealth headquarters, Marcus hesitated at the entrance. The revolving glass doors felt like a barrier to a world he no longer belonged to. "You'll be fine," Brian said, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Inside, the polished floors and gleaming surfaces seemed almost blinding. Employees bustled about, their conversations punctuated by the hum of phones and keyboards. Marcus felt every eye on him, though most were likely too preoccupied to notice. Brian led him into a conference room where a handful of executives were waiting. Their suits were sharp, their expressions unreadable. Brian introduced Marcus with a level of respect that immediately silenced any skepticism. "Marcus has first-hand experience with the challenges our industry creates," Brian began, "and he has ideas that could transform how we approach community health care." Marcus hesitated, his palms sweating as he looked around the room. He had spent years in meetings like these, but the weight of his fall from grace made the moment feel different. "Go ahead," Brian encouraged. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. He outlined ideas for community outreach programs, focusing on accessibility and transparency. His passion grew as he spoke, fueled by his own experiences and the knowledge that real change was possible. By the end of his presentation, the room was silent. Then one of the executives, a woman with sharp eyes and a thoughtful expression, leaned forward. "Those are excellent ideas," she said. Brian grinned. "That's why I'm offering Marcus a position in our new community outreach and affordable care division. He's exactly the person we need to lead it." The announcement stunned Marcus. "Lead?" he echoed. Brian nodded. "This is your chance to make a difference, Marcus, to help others the way you wanted to help me that night." Overwhelmed, Marcus barely managed to nod. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice trembling. That evening, back in his apartment, Marcus replayed the day's events in his mind. He felt torn between excitement and fear, but Brian's words echoed in his head. "This is your chance." 3 months later, Marcus stood at the podium in a packed conference room, the buzz of conversation filling the air. The walls were lined with posters promoting United Health Group's new initiatives, projects Marcus had spearheaded. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd. Among them were Brian, the executive team, and a number of community leaders. Cameras flashed as he began to speak. 3 months ago, Marcus started, his voice steady. "I was living in a shelter, struggling to survive. But today, I stand here because someone believed in me. And because of that, I now have the chance to pay it forward." The room erupted in applause. Marcus went on to outline the programs he had developed: mobile health clinics, partnerships with local organizations, and simplified insurance plans for low-income families. His passion was evident, his voice ringing with conviction as he spoke about the importance of accessible healthcare. After the event, Brian approached Marcus, a proud smile on his face. "You were incredible up there," he said. "Thanks to you," Marcus replied. Brian shook his head. "This was all you. I just gave you the tools. You made it happen." As the months passed, Marcus's impact grew. The programs he launched began making tangible differences in underserved communities. His work attracted media attention, and soon, Marcus found himself at the forefront of a national conversation about healthcare reform. One evening, during a company gala, Brian took the stage to make a surprise announcement. "Tonight," Brian began, "we celebrate not just the achievements of our company, but the incredible work of one man. Marcus, please join me on stage." Marcus rose, his heart pounding as the room erupted into applause. Brian handed him a plaque, engraved with his name, and the words, "Champion of Change." "There's one more thing," Brian said, his voice filled with emotion. "In honor of Marcus's late wife, we're establishing the Elaine Whitaker Scholarship Fund to support students pursuing careers in community healthcare." Tears welled in Marcus's eyes as the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Later that night, as Marcus stood outside under the stars, he reflected on how far he had come. From the bitter cold of that snowy night to the warmth of this moment, it had been a journey he never could have imagined. "I'll keep paying it forward," he whispered to the night sky, a promise to himself and the wife he had lost. In that moment, Marcus knew his mission had only just begun. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of kindness, redemption, and the power of second chances. Marcus's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, a single act of compassion can spark a ripple effect of change. It's a powerful reminder to never underestimate the impact of extending a helping hand. If this story touched you, don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. We love hearing from you. And be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another inspiring story. Let us know where you're listening from too. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay kind, and remember that even small actions can create big changes.